Hello coders, welcome to Coding Everyday. My name is Otto and this is another episode of the Asta Manager project. In the last few episodes we've seen how we could have a React app as a for the front end and how we can have Azure Functions as a basic backend. It doesn't do much for now. And how we can use a static web app to link everything together and also have the benefit of having an authentication server that we can then use in production to authenticate with Twitter and other providers. In this episode, we will start working a little bit more on the backend, and we start adding some structure to it instead of being just one Azure Functions project. So let's see how we can do this. We can do this using what is called the clean architecture design. So what clean architecture is, in a nutshell, is a way to structure your code so that your domain, which is your business logic, stays at the core and everything else is essentially abstracted away. And then on top of that abstraction, you can have an implementation for your infrastructure, for your presentation. So in our case, infrastructure might be, actually it will be Cosmos DB as a data access layer. For our presentation, we have Azure Functions because that's how we will expose the backend to the internet. And of course, you can have other layers here that connect to the domain. And another thing to mention is that sometimes we will see that the domain is actually split in two parts. You have the domain core, which is essentially everything that you can share across the organization, or in our cases is going to be just models and interfaces. And then you have a domain application layer where the things that you put in there are specific to this project, or in our case we will have the actual implementation of those interfaces. The reason I like to have the core just with the interfaces and some models is just so that if I have to use the interfaces somewhere else, I just need to depend on the core and not on the actual implementation at the application level. So let's see how this goes in practice. In this episode, we will actually just create the domain part of it, and in future episodes, we'll start implementing the infrastructure, and then we will have a look at how to implement then the presentation layer. So let's get started. Let's open Visual Studio, which I have here. So this is where we left. Let's create another project here. It's going to be a .NET 5 in my case. Of course, you can use ASP.NET Core if you want. Sorry, .NET Core if you want. Okay, I'll go with class library and we call this Asta Domain Core. Fine. Now the first thing that I want to do is delete this class. We won't need that. It's not. This is interesting. Let's open it in Explorer and see. So it actually deleted, but it didn't delete from the project file. It did delete. Okay, I just had to save. Okay, then another thing that I like to do, and this is the reason I'm using Visual Studio and not Visual Studio Code, is because you have nice interfaces like this. So if I want to rename the default namespace, I just have to do that and save. And for you guys that use Visual Studio Code, I'll show how this looks. So you just have to add the root namespace there, and that's all it is. So in the core we only have interfaces and models. So let's add a first folder. We for sure have services that we are going to use in our Azure functions. So the first service that we are going to implement is an account service. So we can start to add that information about the users that actually registered with our website. So let's add a new, I selected class, but I will select interface from here and go with iAccount service. Okay, what we want this to be public first of all, and of course we want a couple of methods in here. So one method that we want is find account to see if for a given provider and user an account already exists, and if it doesn't, we want a create account method that is going to create a user given the user, the provider, and the user ID. So this information, as you can remember, is the information that comes from the static web app. So we will use that information to create an account and store the user information. Let's also create this account data model. So we'll create the models folder here. And we create account data. So account data is a public class that has a list of users and a display name. So let's add the user data as well as a model. And the user data in this case is just the information that we need about the user, and is public, of course. So now if we go to account data, it should all work. So as you can see, because I changed the default namespace, when I create a class, it creates it in this base namespace, and then based on the folder structure it would add dot models. I find it easier if I have the application, the domain core and the domain application layers. They both should have the same namespace. It's just a matter of if you have just the interfaces or the actual implementation of those. Now another thing that I want all the documents that we are going to save in the database. I want all those to have a basic structure. So I will add a base class for those, and I will call it Asta document. So any Asta document, which is what we save in the containers, will have this base class, and it's nothing more than having some basic properties here. I will also make this abstract, just because it has to be inherited from. So let's go to our account data. When we save the account, we also save the users. So the user model won't need an Asta document because we are going to save everything together. So this way, as you can see, we also allow an account to have a display name, whatever the user wants to see when you use their name on the website. And also we have a list of users. So of course in the beginning, when you create a new account, you will only have one user, the user that you are authenticating in that moment. But in the future we want to expand that and allow you to link multiple accounts to multiple providers. multiple external providers to your account, so that if you don't remember, let's say, your Twitter password, you can log in with the Google one, etc. And that's that. Of course, the service here will need the using the namespace. Sorry, the using. And then another thing that we don't want services to contact the database directly. We will use the repository pattern, which is just a way to abstract away how services communicate with data sources. So this is what we will have. We will have a repos folder. I prefer to call it repos just because it's shorter, so I don't have to type repository, it feels too long. And we create a new interface. We call it iRepo, and this is also public. And I also like to make it generic, so that you don't have, when you create a new repository, when you create a new, let's say that you want to store something new in your data store, you don't really want to create a class and create a lot of things. What you want to do is you want it to be simple, so you create the model that you need, and then you have one line of code to say to identify in your code that you want to access that kind of data, and that should be it. So in order to do that, we will create this generic, and of course whatever we save or in our database is going to be an Asta document by default. We will have some methods here to start with. We will add more later as we go along and as we see that we need them. So we have an insert, we have a read, we have an update, a delete, and these are the CRUD operations. So create, read, update, and delete, for short, CRUD. And then we have find one or null, which is essentially just a way for us to search if a particular user already exists in the database, so we can actually search in other columns, not just those of the Asta document model here. Okay, so let's see that it actually builds, and it does. So now let's move to the application layer. So we create a new project, class library, Asta domain application. Let's create that. And again, we delete this class. Let's close this, delete it again. Not exactly sure why this is continuing to happen, but anyway, let's also update the default namespace for this. I don't know why this has to continue to do that for me. So that's it, and we save, and okay, we are ready to continue. So in this case, we only have the services to implement, because the repository is actually infrastructure. So we will implement the repositories in a different project in a later video. So we create a class, git create a class, and this is account service, and this public. And as you can see, I cannot actually type, so I will stop pretending. we will need to implement from this repository, and in order to do that, this has to have a project reference to the core. So now that that's there, we can implement the interface by doing by using the helper here and implement the interface. We'll have a constructor, and the constructor will have an I repo of count data. Let's call it just repo. I'm not sure if we will have more. Let's add a field for it and then a null check. And now that we have the field and the null check, I can just go and paste in the implementation for this method. So for the create account, we just create the data structure, and we use the repository to insert, and that's it. Super simple. For the find account instead, we will have just one line of code, which is this one. So we will use the find one or null to search in the default partition. So we'll have our account list, at least that's what I'm thinking to do. We will have just one partition, and we will have all the accounts in there. And of course, the more accounts we have, the more expensive this query will be on that. But yeah, maybe in the future we can say let's split the accounts by the first letter, so we have 26 or I don't know, different partitions, or maybe the first 5. We can use the first 5 values of the ID of the document or something like that. Okay, so now that we have this implementation, let's see if this project builds, and it does. And as you can see, we have a service that actually does some business logic, like create an account, but you don't have to have an actual definition for what the repository is, where you grab the data from. That's all abstracted away. So that's how the domain bit of the clean architecture work. And of course, this really fulfills our requirements, so that in the future, if we want to change from Cosmos DB to something else, it would be super easy, because all you need to do is to create another infrastructure layer project with whatever technology you want to use, and you implement an iRepository, which is quite generic. And once you have this, you can actually start using it and just change the dependency injection, so that when you have one of these, instead of implementing it with Cosmos DB, you use the other implementation, whatever the data access you want to use is. In fact, in the very next episode, we'll see how we can have an in-memory version of these repositories, and that will be super helpful for us for testing purposes, so that we can actually run what I like to call domain tests, but on data access that is in memory. So everything is in memory, and it's super fast. You don't have to wait for the database, you don't have to have external dependencies. It's like a unit test, but it's testing the entirety of your business logic for one particular call to the API. Okay, I think that's it for this episode. Thank you guys for staying with me. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a thumbs up if you like this episode. See you next time. Thanks, bye.